I'm Julie Herman of Baby Quilt, and welcome back to the Alphabet Soup Sew Along. Today we're going to be working on the baby quilt. I love the baby quilt for many reasons, but the number one reason I love the baby quilt is for how you can personalize it. So I've made this a few times. The first time I made it is the one that's featured on the cover of the book, and as you can see it says run, jump, skip, hop, play. I give you in the book, where you can find the baby quilt on page 52, a ton of different examples of words, but you can customize it even further to fit your needs and make your quilt a one-of-a-kind. So I have also made the quilt for my son William. I made this when I was pregnant, and I used it in the birth announcement. And I used my treasured Neptune stash, and it says, "Baby, you are so loved." And you know, baby wasn't here yet, but it was my way of telling baby, you're loved even before you're here. So I treasure this quilt, and I backed it in Minky, and he loves this and likes to cuddle with it. And then the quilt I have been working on for the sew along and that I'm going to work on with you today says cut, pin, sew, make quilt, because I thought it was really funny to make a quilt about quilting. You know, that's my humor for you. This is actually the second time I've made this quilt. The first one is out on a trunk show right now, so I don't have that one to show you, but I can show you a picture of it. And so for this one, I've gone ahead and used all the skills we've built so far to piece all of my blocks, to cut all of my sashing, and I got everything ready to go. In our last lesson, we talked about sewing our sashing to our letters and focused on having our letter on top of our sashing. But I mentioned that the name quilt I was working on had no places where there was no sashing. This quilt does. So for instance, the E to the W here, there's no sashing. And then again, from the L to the T, there's no sashing. So I want to focus on those areas to show you how I decide which letter goes on top and what I focus on when I'm at the machine, when I'm sewing letters together that don't have sashing. So I'm going to jump right on in. Let's get started. I'm going to start here with the E to the W. And in deciding which piece I'm going to put on top, I'm going to look at the elements of my letter that are at the seam that I'm going to be working on. And here I have my points of my E, but they're not actually even finished yet because I haven't sewn on my top and bottom, but that point there is finished. So I'm going to decide to put the W on top of the E, and so I'm going to place the W on top of the E. It's up to you if you want to use pins here. I'm not going to use pins. I'm going to zoom in so you can see a little closer. And I'm simply going to sew my same scant 1/4 inch seam. One last thing to note is if you have followed my videos for any length of time, you know that I almost exclusively piece with Aurifil 2600. That's not the case today. So today I am using a navy that matches my background. Since my blocks are pieced at this point and most of what I'm going to be sewing is navy to navy, I want it to blend in, and where my medium gray works as a general rule of thumb, when I'm going to be piecing a lot of the same fabric to the same fabric, I like to use coordinating thread in case you see any of that on the front. I am not going to backstitch at the beginning or end because our sashing is going to go ahead and be sewn onto these later on. So I'm simply going to sew nice and slow. And I can use a stiletto if I need it. And I want to make sure I'm also not flipping these seams on the bottom. So I'm just going to double check every once in a while, make sure things look good. And sew the length of this seam. Our next combination that doesn't have a spacer is the L to the T. And in this case, I've got the point of my L here, but I also have the point of the T. Now I'm going to decide that the point of the L is more important than the point of the T for two reasons. One, because if I'm a little off here, it is cream to cream, it's still going to work, where if I accidentally cover up this point, you're really going to see it because it's cream to blue. And because it looks like I was pretty perfect piecing here, and I wasn't perfect here. If you see, this piece kind of goes in a little bit. So in order to make the accommodations needed to make sure I get right on that point, I'm going to put the L on top of the T, and then I'm going to rotate it this way. And I am going to sew my scant 1/4 inch seam. And when I get to this area, I'm going to be more focused on that my needle goes in right there than I am a perfect 1/4 inch. This piece is probably going to be in a little bit, and you're probably going to see that, and that's okay. I'll just adjust as I go. So again, I'm going to zoom in for you. I'm just gonna line this up down here, and now I'm gonna focus on this. I'm gonna grab my stiletto, and what I wanna make sure is that my needle goes in right where my point was created. So here is my E to my W, and looks great. Didn't lose my point there. That point appears to be a 1/4 inch in, which is what I'm gonna want when sewing my sashing on, that one as well. So I'm happy with how this one turned out. And then my L to my T, let's see. That looks great as well. I didn't lose my point. And turned out perfect up there as well. Doesn't always happen, but lucked out. And if you have two letters that are coming together in a complicated way, another thing that you can do is you can sew parts. So if you imagine here is you could just sew this little section, stop, take it off, sew this little section, stop, take it off, use those as thread pinning, open it up, check them, adjust if needed, and then when everything is good, leave that stitching in and stitch along the length of the entire piece. I've done that more than once when I really want to make sure that 2 points line up exactly perfectly with the seam that I am putting together. As I mentioned earlier, in the last video I went over sewing the sashing to the blocks. I'll give you a quick refresher on that, and then I am going to sew the rest of it off film. And if you would like to watch me sew the quilt from the last video, William's name, we'll put a link right here so you can click on that to see how I sewed each of the sashings onto the letter. But here I've simply taken my L on top of my sashing, and again, no back stitching at the beginning and end. And because I have navy thread here, you will see it on this side, but that's okay since we're sewing it to a navy piece. If it pops up in any way, you won't see it. Normally I would not sew navy if I was sewing two cream things or cream to something lighter. So I'm going to go ahead, continue to sew the rest of my pieces of sashing on, and I'll be back in a moment with all of my word strips done. After you have your rows assembled, it's time to press. And I suggest generally pressing out to the sashing, and that is for any of the side fillers as well as the sashing between the letters. In the case of this though, you don't have sashing to press to. So where do you press? The answer is whichever way you want. You can decide to press one way. I would probably go this way because there's a little more white here than here, or you can just opt to flip it over and press open, like we did with the other seams so far in the project. Whichever way you prefer is the right answer for your project. I have done it different ways. You just want to make sure whichever way, whether it's open or to the side, that you're pressing it well so that everything is nice and flat. I've completed sewing and pressing all 5 of my words, and I have stacked them on top of each other, centered. And you'll notice there is slight differences, about 1/8 of an inch total in the width. Yours may be more, yours may be less. If it's more, you might want to remove some of these and add larger ones. If it's too small, if it's too big, you can just trim it off. What I'm gonna do now is I'm just going to trim off just a tiny bit so that all of my rows are exactly the same size. So I'm trimming 1/8 or less from each one of mine. And I'm going to repeat that on the other end as well. And then I'm going to remeasure, and mine measure 40 inches wide. According to the pattern, they should be 40.5, but as you know, piecing, things happen, whatnot, and things are rarely exactly as they should be. So go ahead and measure the width of yours. Like I said, mine are 40, so I'm now going to cut 4 of my sashing pieces down to 40 inches in length to be my horizontal sashing pieces. Then once my sashing pieces are cut, I am going to follow the same steps that I did in the previous video, which is to fold my sashing in half and finger press or pin, quarter it, finger press or pin, do the same with my strip. And that way I know when I am pinning it across the whole length that I am splitting the difference evenly so that I don't get wavy sashing or wavy borders. And after everything is pinned, I'm going to head over to the machine and sew all of my sashing in place to complete the center of my quilt top. I'll put a link here to the last video we did where I show this in detail. After you finish sewing all of your words and your sashing together to create the center of the quilt top, it's time to go ahead and press. And I suggest pressing to the sashing So I'm just going to go ahead and press all of my sashing. And then I need to go ahead and double check my border measurements. Border measurements are provided on page 52, but I suggest you measure the width and the height of your quilt. Things can change, and you should cut your border measurements exact to what you're working with. They will probably need to be pieced because they're longer than the width of fabric. So go ahead and figure out what border measurement lengths you need for your project, and go ahead, piece them and cut them. And then I'm going to go ahead and put my borders on in the same method that I did my sashing, which is I'm going to fold my project in half and in quarters. We're going to start with the side borders. So once I have all of this pressed, I will go ahead and bring my fifth word up to my first word, and my half should be halfway in the middle of my third word. And then go ahead and do my quarters, and that way you don't end up with any waviness when you put your borders onto your quilt to finish your baby quilt. I've now finished the top of my baby quilt. I hope you have enjoyed today's lesson and all of the previous lessons during the Alphabet Soup Sew Along. If you have, please click like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions, you can ask them here or in the Jaybird Quilt Sew Along Facebook group. I'll be back here in a few days to do a live to answer any questions you have for the Alphabet Soup Sew Along. And then I will be back in May to do Telescope. And also in May, we are going to be doing the first Lazy Girl Design Sew Along, which will be the Lily Pocket Purse. So I look forward to seeing you again soon in another Sew Along. Thanks so much.